In 1953, a woman standing at the Woolworth's fragrance counter on a Thursday afternoon could close her eyes, inhale the dense cloud of competing florals and aldehydes floating up from the glass display case, and feel, for one suspended moment, entirely rich. The bottles lined up before her, squat, cheerful, their labels printed in hot pink and gold, were not from Paris. They were not signed by Coty's most celebrated nose or sealed with the wax crest of a department store perfumer. They were drugstore fragrances, mass-produced in New Jersey and Ohio, priced between 59 cents and $1.25, and they were, to the average American woman of the post-war decade, as close to luxury as the weekly household budget would allow. What happened at that counter, and in the medicine cabinets and bureau drawers of 10 million American homes, was not a compromise. It was a revolution in how ordinary women understood and claimed the right to smell beautiful. The post-war American economy had done something remarkable to the fragrance industry. Before the war, perfume in America was bifurcated along sharp class lines. You either bought imported French luxury, Chanel, Lanvin, Guerlain, at a department store where the saleswoman wore white gloves and raised one eyebrow at your coat, or you went without. The concept of a middle market barely existed. But the GI Bill, suburban expansion, and the extraordinary rise of the five-and-dime retail model in the late 1940s created an entirely new consumer, the working-class and lower-middle-class housewife who had disposable income, even if modest, and a ferocious appetite for the markers of femininity that advertising had been drumming into her consciousness since the day she first opened a magazine. Fragrance companies read this landscape and moved fast. By 1953, the American drugstore fragrance market was dominated by a handful of companies who had mastered the art of the affordable dream. Yardley of London had been producing English lavender and April violet since the previous century, but their American drugstore distribution in the early 50s made them a household name at a price point that virtually any woman could reach. At $1.15 for a small bottle of April Violet's cologne, a woman could buy herself a proper English floral and leave the pharmacy with change from $1.25. Harriet Hubbard Eyre, whose name carried the romantic weight of a beauty pioneer, the original Eyre had been one of the first American women to build a cosmetics empire in the 1890s, was now a drugstore staple, with colognes and toilet waters that borrowed the name's prestige and sold for under $1 at chains like Rexall and Lane Bryant's adjacent beauty counters. Coty, founded in Paris but thoroughly Americanized by the early 50s, was perhaps the single most important player in the mass fragrance market. Their Lemon, a soft, powdery floral released in 1927, had never gone out of production, and by 1953 it sat comfortably in the drugstore case at 89 cents per bottle, unchanged in its essential character, deeply familiar to women who had worn it through the Depression and the war and were now wearing it in their new suburban kitchens. Lemon smelled like a memory of romance, powdery white flowers, a whisper of musk, the faintest undertone of something almost soapy and entirely clean. It was the fragrance equivalent of a movie you'd seen enough times to love without criticism. Coty also produced Emeraude, which aimed slightly higher with its warm amber and vanilla base, and Paris, which tried to evoke the romantic myth of the French capital for women who would never see it. Both sat under $1.25 at most American drugstores. What made these fragrances culturally significant was not their formula, but their function. In 1953, a woman's scent was understood to be a component of her social identity, as fixed and deliberate as her hairstyle or her shoe choice. The etiquette manuals of the period, and there were many, published by columnists like Dorothy Dix and distributed through women's magazines with titles like American Home and McCall's, were explicit on the subject. A well-groomed woman wore fragrance at all times, applied at the pulse points before leaving the house, refreshed after lunch, and reapplied before dinner with the seriousness of a professional preparing for a performance. The notion that fragrance was optional or merely pleasant had not yet taken hold. It was, according to the social consensus of the post-war decade, a duty of femininity. The psychology embedded in this expectation is worth pausing over. For women of the 1950s, particularly those living in the new suburban developments outside Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles, the daily application of fragrance was one of the few acts of private sensory pleasure that the domestic routine reliably permitted. A woman might spend her morning managing a household, attending to children, preparing food, all of it demanding, all of it oriented entirely toward others. But the moment at the vanity, uncapping a small glass bottle and pressing it to her wrist, belonged only to her. The fragrance industry understood this perfectly, and the advertising copy of the period leaned heavily into the language of personal transformation and quiet self-possession. Coty advertisements showed women tilting their chins slightly upward, eyes half closed, as though the act of applying perfume had momentarily transported them somewhere else entirely. This was not accidental. The drugstore fragrance market was selling escape at a price that the week's grocery budget could absorb. The physical presentation of five and dime fragrances in 1953 deserves its own consideration, because the packaging was doing enormous cultural work. Unlike the severe modernist flacons of high-end French perfumers, drugstore bottles tended toward the cheerfully decorative, pressed glass with moulded floral motifs, pastel-coloured caps in pearlescent pink or baby blue, labels that featured soft watercolour illustrations of garden scenes or women with windswept hair standing in meadows. Tangy, best known for its lipsticks, also produced a line of toilet waters whose bottles sat on vanity tables like small pieces of decorative glass, catching the light from a window and throwing little prisms across the wall. A woman who owned 3 or 4 of these bottles arranged on her dresser possessed, visually, something that looked remarkably like a beauty collection, an assemblage of objects that said she took her appearance seriously, that she was a participant in the culture of feminine self-cultivation, that she belonged to the world the magazines described. The olfactory landscape of those bottles is harder to reconstruct with precision, because the fragrance formulation practices of the early 1950s relied heavily on natural raw materials, real Bulgarian rose absolute, genuine oak moss, civet, castoreum, that have since been restricted or abandoned entirely by the International Fragrance Association due to allergen concerns and ethical sourcing complications. What this means, practically, is that a bottle of 1953 Coty Le Mans smelled richer and more animalic in its base notes than any contemporary reconstruction could achieve. The powdery florals were denser, the musks warmer and more intimate, the overall effect more complex despite the modest price. The chemistry of mass-market fragrance in 1953 was, in absolute terms, more naturalistic than much of what now sells for triple the price. The social geography of how these fragrances were bought and worn reveals the class dynamics of the early 50s consumer economy with uncomfortable clarity. Women who shopped at Woolworth's or Kresge's or the local Rexall drugstore for their fragrance did not typically discuss this habit with women who shopped at department store counters. The invisible social taxonomy of scent, who wore Chanel No. 5 versus who wore Coty Le Mans, who could afford the Arden counter at Macy's versus who refreshed from a small bottle pulled from a purse in a gas station bathroom, mapped almost perfectly onto the existing hierarchies of class, education, and marital status. And yet the women at the drugstore counter were often wearing something chemically similar to their wealthier counterparts, because the same flavour houses that supplied the luxury perfume industry also supplied the mass market, adjusting concentrations and compositions to hit different price targets. The gap between the dream and the reality was smaller than the price difference suggested. By the mid-1950s, the five and dime fragrance culture had produced something that neither the industry nor the cultural critics of the period fully recognized in the moment. A generation of American women who considered fragrance a basic personal grooming requirement rather than an occasional luxury. This is the direct antecedent of the contemporary mass-market fragrance aisle, where products at every price point compete for the same customer who has been trained since childhood to understand that personal scent is identity made airborne. The woman who stopped at the Woolworths counter in 1953 and deliberated between English lavender and emerald was not a marginal figure in the history of American consumer culture. She was its centre of gravity, and the industry knew it. The retail environment in which all of this fragrance commerce unfolded was itself a sensory experience carefully managed by the five and dime chains. Woolworths in particular had developed a house style for its cosmetic and fragrance displays that combined abundance, many bottles, many options, the pleasurable visual chaos of competing colours and labels, with just enough organisation to prevent the display from reading as a jumble sale. The fragrance section was typically positioned near the store entrance, so that the ambient scent of competing colognes and toilet waters functioned as an atmospheric welcome that drew customers deeper into the store. The psychology of this placement was sound. A woman who entered Woolworths through a corridor of fragrance was already in a state of mild sensory activation, her attention oriented toward beauty and pleasure, before she reached the sewing notions or the household supplies that might have been her stated reason for stopping. The five and dime understood, before the term experiential retail existed to describe it, that the environment in which a product was sold was itself a component of the product's appeal. The seasonal marketing rhythms of the drugstore fragrance market in 1953 followed the same calendar logic that the broader gift industry obeyed. Christmas was the peak fragrance gifting season, and the weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas saw the drugstore fragrance display supplemented by gift sets, a cologne bottle paired with a dusting powder in the same scent, or a trio of small eau de cologne bottles in complementary fragrances from the same brand, wrapped in cellophane with a satin bow and priced between $1 and $2.50 for the complete set. These gift sets were the entry point for many women into fragrance brands they might not have purchased for themselves, received from husbands or parents or siblings who had solved the gift problem by walking into the nearest Rexall and pointing at the most attractively packaged item on the counter. Valentine's Day was the secondary fragrance gifting moment, smaller in dollar volume but significant in its emotional charge. A bottle of cologne given on Valentine's Day carried a different weight than the same bottle given at Christmas, and the fragrance companies were sophisticated enough to market against this distinction with separate seasonal advertising. The question of how fragrance interacted with the other scented products in a woman's daily grooming routine, her scented soap, her talcum powder, her hair-setting lotion, was addressed in the beauty literature of the period under the concept of fragrance wardrobe management, a phrase that suggests a level of olfactory sophistication that the actual products being discussed did not entirely support, but that the aspirational beauty culture of the era consistently promoted. The advice was to choose a fragrance family and stay within it. If you wore a floral cologne, use a floral-scented dusting powder and a floral-adjacent soap. The competing scents of a floral cologne with a heavily musky talcum powder and a sharply medicinal soap would, the beauty editors warned, produce an effect that was less than the sum of its parts. Most women did not follow this advice with any consistency, because most women bought their soap on the basis of price and cleansing performance, and their powder on the basis of texture, and did not particularly coordinate either with their fragrance. But the advice itself reveals the degree to which the beauty culture of the period was attempting to train women to think about their self-presentation as a total system rather than a collection of separate product decisions. The compact snapped shut with a sound like a small pistol being cocked, and every woman within earshot understood exactly what it meant. She was done. She had looked. She had corrected. She'd returned to the world with her face exactly as she intended it to be presented. In 1953, the act of checking one's rouge in a compact mirror was one of the most charged small dramas of public femininity, simultaneously an assertion of self-awareness and a performance of fastidious grooming that the decade social codes required of respectable women at every income level. The powder blush compact, that flat, hinged disc of pressed pigment and milled talc, was one of the most essential objects in the American woman's purse, and it cost, at a drugstore in 1953, somewhere between 35 cents and $1.10 depending on the brand, the quality of the pressed cake, and whether the compact casing was bare tin or something with decorative pretensions. The colour palette of 1953 rouge was a sharply defined world, with very little room for individual interpretation. The ideal cheek colour, as established by the consensus of beauty editors, advertising imagery, and the visual grammar of Hollywood film, all of which converged in this era with unusual coherence, was a specific shade of warm rose pink that sat precisely between coral and fuchsia, without committing to either. Too orange and you read as outdated, a holdover from the theatrical face of the 1940s stage. Too cool, and you read as pallid, unwell, the kind of woman who had not gotten enough fresh air and was possibly not managing her household responsibilities with sufficient vigour. The sweet spot was a luminous, slightly warm rose, the colour of a cheek flushed by a brisk autumn walk, translated into cosmetic form and pressed into a neat circular cake that a woman could apply in 3 efficient strokes of a flat brush, or the small horsehair puff that came pressed into the lid. The brands commanding this market in 1953 at the drugstore price point were a specific and well-established group. Max Factor's Pancake Rouge, technically an extension of their legendary Pancake foundation system, had crossed over from the professional makeup world into the consumer market and sat at drugstore counters for under $1, offering a professional-grade pressed pigment in a range of shades that Factor's Hollywood laboratory had developed specifically for the photographic demands of film. When a woman in Cleveland or Memphis bought Max Factor Rouge at her local Rexall, she was purchasing the same product formulation used on studio actresses, or so the advertising implied, and it implied this heavily, repeatedly, and with full confidence that the association would translate into sales. It did. Coty's Air-Spun Rouge, which extended the brand's famous loose powder technology into a compressed blush format, was softer in pigment and easier to blend, making it forgiving for the less practiced hand. At 65 cents for a compact that would last 6 months with daily use, it was one of the great value propositions in the drugstore beauty market. Tangi occupied a fascinating and somewhat philosophically peculiar corner of the rouge market. Tangi's original lipstick, launched in the 1920s, was built on the colour-adapting technology that caused the product to shift from its orange-in-the-tube appearance to a personalised pink to rose shade on each individual wearer's lips, responding to the unique chemistry of each woman's skin. By the early 50s, Tangi had extended this concept to their rouge line, marketing the colour change compact as the solution for women uncertain about which shade would suit them. The product would, theoretically, adapt to your particular complexion and produce exactly the right rose for your specific face. The science behind this was more marketing poetry than rigorous chemistry, but the psychological appeal was powerful. In a market where the wrong shade of rouge was a socially legible mistake, Tangi offered something close to the promise of infallibility. Application technique in 1953 was governed by rules as precise and codified as the rules governing proper table setting or correct formal letter salutation. The dominant application method, described in virtually every beauty manual of the period, from Helena Rubinstein's published guides to the monthly beauty columns in Ladies' Home Journal, involved smiling broadly to locate the apple of the cheek, applying the rouge there as a soft oval, and then blending upward and slightly outward toward the temple, in a motion that was supposed to follow the natural plane of the cheekbone. This upward sweep was critical. Downward blending created what beauty editors of the period described with visible alarm as a dragging effect that aged the face and disrupted the smooth upward visual line that the ideal 1950s face required. The entire aesthetic philosophy of the decade's makeup was organised around creating a face that appeared naturally flushed, effortlessly healthy, and geometrically balanced. and rouge was the instrument that produced the warmth essential to that effect. The sociology of rouge application in public spaces reveals something important about the negotiation between private grooming and public femininity that the 1950s constantly demanded of women. Applying lipstick in public was generally considered acceptable, and even, in certain contexts, mildly glamorous. A woman touching up her lips in a restaurant mirror was performing her femininity for a social audience, and this was understood as appropriate. Rouge was more complicated. Applying powder blush in a restaurant or theatre was considered by many etiquette authorities of the period to be slightly too intimate. It revealed the constructed nature of the face in a way that was somehow more exposing than lipstick application, perhaps because the compact and puff implied a level of touching and patting that felt too close to the bedroom. The compromise most women arrived at was applying rouge at the beginning and end of the day from the vanity at home, and using the compact primarily for powder touch-ups in public while reserving any actual blush refreshing for the ladies' room, a space where the social fiction of effortless grooming could be temporarily suspended. The compact itself, the physical object that housed the rouge, was a subject of significant aesthetic attention and modest aspiration in 1953. The drugstore compacts available at Woolworths and Kresge's were predominantly pressed tin, printed with floral patterns or geometric Art Deco holdovers, occasionally given a faux tortoiseshell finish that lasted approximately 3 weeks before chipping. But the better drugstore brands, the Coty compacts in particular, had a quality of finish that sat just above the purely utilitarian. Coty's Rouge compacts featured smooth gold-tone closures and embossed lids with the brand's name in a font elegant enough to pass at a glance as something more expensive than it was. This was intentional and considered. The compact lived in the purse, came out at the restaurant table, clicked open in the theatre lobby, and whatever it looked like in those moments was a small but non-trivial statement about its owner. The aspirational tier existed just above the drugstore compact and was occupied by the Stratton compact, imported from England and available in America at specialty stores and department store gift counters at prices between $3 and $15. A Stratton compact, with its smooth gold fill and engine-turned case, its satisfying heft and its butter-smooth hinge action, was a graduation gift and a birthday present and an anniversary token, and it was also available in versions that could be monogrammed. A woman who carried a Stratton compact, even one filled with Coty Rouge from the drugstore, was operating at a slightly different social register than the woman whose compact was the original Rexall purchase tin. The content might be identical. The container communicated something about aspiration, about a woman's relationship to her own grooming as a practice worth investing in beautiful tools. Today, the pressed blush compact as a category is experiencing something close to a renaissance, driven partly by the nostalgia economy and partly by genuine recognition that the format, portable, long-lasting, easy to apply, remains one of the most practical ways to carry facial colour. The brands that dominate social media discussion of vintage blush tend toward the reconstructed and the artisanal. Companies that are deliberately evoking the aesthetic of the 1950s, compact in their packaging while reformulating with modern skincare-adjacent ingredients and updated pigment technology. What has not changed is the fundamental transaction at the heart of the act. A woman opens a compact, looks at herself in a small mirror, applies colour to her cheeks, and returns to the world feeling, in some incremental but real way, more fully herself. The compact clicks shut. The sound carries. The historical arc of the specific rose pink that the 1953 beauty consensus had decided was correct for the American cheek is a story that connects the theatrical makeup traditions of the 19th century to the photographic demands of early 20th century film and then forward into the television era that was just beginning to reshape visual culture in 1953. The first generation of Hollywood films with synchronized sound had produced a crisis in the existing theatrical makeup vocabulary because stage makeup designed for visibility across a proscenium distance looked grotesque in close-up on a film screen. Max Factor, working in his Hollywood laboratory through the 1920s and 30s, had developed a series of makeup formulations specifically calibrated to the colour response of orthochromatic and then panchromatic film stock and the cheek colour conventions he established. Warm enough to read as healthy on screen, cool enough to avoid printing as orange on the early panchromatic stocks, had migrated into the consumer market so thoroughly by 1953 that women who had never appeared on a film set were wearing cheek colours that had been optimised for a medium they would only ever experience as an audience member. The vanity table at which the average American woman of 1953 sat to apply her rouge was itself a studied piece of domestic furniture carrying its own social significance. The vanity, a small writing desk-style table with a mirror, a bench or stool, and typically a pair of drawers for storage, was a standard element of the post-war suburban bedroom, included in the furniture sets that the new department stores and mail-order catalogues sold to newly married couples outfitting their first houses. It was understood as a feminine workspace, the domestic counterpart to the husband's garage workbench, a place dedicated to a specific kind of skilled, regular, necessary labour. A woman sitting at her vanity table to do her makeup in the morning was not engaged in vanity in the moral sense, the luxury and the self-indulgence the word implies, but in the practical sense, she was performing the maintenance work that her social and professional obligations required of her face. The beauty columns that addressed this ritual consistently framed it as efficiency practice rather than indulgence, recommending that the vanity be organised to allow the application sequence to be completed as quickly as possible, each product in its designated position, so that no time was wasted reaching or searching during the morning routine. The continental European tradition, against which the American drugstore rouge culture defined itself without quite acknowledging the comparison, operated on different principles and toward different ends. French women of the period, at least as they was mythologized in American beauty writing, which is a distinct category from French women as they actually existed, were described as applying rouge with an artist's freedom rather than a rule follower's precision, smudging and blending by instinct rather than method, achieving a naturalness that the carefully technique-driven American approach was paradoxically always chasing. Whether this mythological French woman and her improvisational rouge represented reality, or a useful narrative contrast for American beauty editors to deploy, is a question worth asking. What is certain is that the discourse about the correct and incorrect use of rouge in the American beauty press of 1953 was operating against an implied backdrop of the wrong way to do it, and the wrong way was always something that could be identified, named, and avoided by the informed consumer who read her beauty column faithfully and applied her Coty air-spun rouge with the appropriate upward sweep. The spatial arrangement of the rouge in the 1953 beauty routine also communicated something about the relationship between American feminine beauty and its European antecedents. The heavy theatrical rouge circle of the 1920s flapper, applied in a bold disc on the central cheek, unmistakably artificial, a deliberate decorative choice rather than a simulation of a natural colour, had given way in the intervening decades to the naturalistic blush philosophy that the 40s and early 50s embraced, in which the function of rouge was to enhance and suggest rather than to declare itself. This shift was part of a broader mid-century movement away from the theatrical and toward the naturalistic in cosmetic application, driven partly by the influence of close-up photography and film, and partly by the post-war social convention that associated heavy visible makeup with either old-fashioned taste or a certain kind of social ambition that the decade's feminine ideal preferred to keep implicit rather than explicit. A woman in 1953 was supposed to look beautiful, but she was also supposed to look as though beauty came naturally to her, and the precise calibration of her rouge was one of the technical instruments through which this social fiction was maintained. Before the wand there was the brush, and before the brush there was the cake, and before the cake there was a small metal tin of black paste that a woman moistened with her own saliva and applied to her lashes with the kind of focused, unhurried attention usually reserved for tasks that mattered enormously. In 1953, mascara was not the fluid, easy application product that would eventually dominate the market in the 1960s and beyond. It was a solid cake of compressed pigment, typically a combination of carbon black, wax and a binding agent, housed in a small oval tin roughly the size of a thumbnail, applied with a short, stiff brush or a specialized spiral wand that required dipping, stroking, and careful separation of lashes with a pin or a specialized lash comb to prevent the clumping that was the great enemy of the mascara application process. The whole procedure, done correctly, took between 5 and 10 minutes and required good lighting, a steady hand, and the kind of patient technical attention that the beauty manuals of the period described without irony as a skill requiring practice. The dominant brand in the American drugstore mascara market in 1953 was Maybelline, and its story is one of the more charming origin narratives in the history of American cosmetics. T.L. Williams, working out of his family kitchen in Chicago sometime around 1913, had observed his sister Mabel applying a mixture of coal dust and petroleum jelly to her lashes to darken and define them, a home remedy that produced satisfactory if messy results. Williams combined Mabel's name with Vaseline, the petroleum jelly she was using, and Maybelline was born as a company, selling a cake mascara by mail order that by the 1920s had become the most popular eye product in the American mass market. By 1953, Maybelline's cake mascara was sold at virtually every drugstore in the country for 25 cents, making it one of the most accessible luxury beauty items in the post-war consumer landscape. The cake lasted months with daily use, required nothing more than a little water or saliva for activation, and delivered the darkened, lengthened lash that the beauty consensus of the period had decided was a non-negotiable component of a properly finished face. The application ritual that a woman undertook with her Maybelline cake mascara in 1953 was a significantly more technically demanding process than anything the contemporary beauty consumer would recognize. The first step was moistening the cake, typically by holding the open tin under a running faucet for a second, or by applying a small amount of water from a dampened fingertip to the surface of the compressed cake. Then the short applicator brush was stroked across the cake, loaded with product, and applied to the upper lashes in a quick upward and outward motion designed to coat each lash individually from root to tip without depositing excess product at the tips that would, upon drying, create the dreaded spider leg effect. The lower lashes were addressed more carefully, often with the tip of the brush rather than its full face, since heavy mascara on the lower lid was associated with a dramatic theatrical look that most women of the period were not attempting for daytime. The product dried in approximately 90 seconds, during which time a lash comb, typically a small metal implement with fine teeth, available for 10 cents at the same drugstore counter, was worked through the lashes to separate any that had bonded together during application. Max Factor entered the drugstore mascara market in this era, with a cake mascara that positioned itself slightly above Maybelline on the quality and price spectrum, available for around 45 to 60 cents, and leveraged its Hollywood studio credibility aggressively in its advertising copy. The Max Factor mascara advertisements of the early 1950s showed actresses with lashes that appeared almost impossibly dense and long, a visual effect achieved in part by the mascaras themselves, and in part by the skilled application of individual false lashes by studio makeup artists, a distinction that the advertisements were not precisely forthcoming about. Women buying Max Factor mascara at their local drugstore were purchasing a product formulated by the man who had literally invented modern theatrical makeup, but they were also purchasing an image of lash glamour that the product alone could not fully deliver. This gap between the advertisement and the achievable result was a permanent feature of the mass beauty market, and was managed by beauty editors and columnists who gently coached readers on realistic technique, while carefully avoiding any criticism of the aspirational advertising that paid for their publications. Helena Rubinstein's Mascara-Matic, which she had introduced in 1952 with the twin innovations of a rotating applicator and a formula designed to create thicker, more flexible film on the lash, was beginning to make inroads in the drugstore market by 1953, though at a price point, around $1.25, that placed it at the premium end of the accessible mascara category. Rubinstein had spent decades positioning herself and her products at the intersection of scientific authority and feminine glamour, and her mascara advertising was correspondingly more clinical in its language than the soft romance of the Maybelline approach. Where Maybelline promised beautiful, mysterious eyes, Rubinstein's copy talked about lash care, about the conditioning properties of her formula, about mascara as something you applied to your lashes in the same spirit that you applied cold cream to your face, as treatment, not merely decoration. This language of beauty as science would expand enormously in the following decades, but its origins lie clearly in this period. The colour range available at the drugstore mascara counter in 1953 was strikingly limited by contemporary standards. Black was the dominant shade, worn by virtually all women regardless of hair colour or skin tone, because the beauty consensus of the period held that black mascara was the correct mascara in the same way that black shoes were the correct shoe, non-negotiable for any woman who took her appearance seriously. Brown mascara existed for women who found pure black too severe, and it was available from Maybelline and a few competitors, but it occupied an apologetic position in the product lineup, recommended primarily for fair-skinned blondes who might read as too harsh in black. Navy, burgundy and green mascara were available from certain specialty brands, but were firmly in the novelty category. Interesting to think about, not something a woman with any claim to conventional good taste would actually wear on a Tuesday in 1953. The entire philosophy of colour usage in the decade's makeup was organised around restraint and correctness, and mascara was no exception. The smudging problem was the great practical crisis of 1953 mascara, and it generated a small industry of accessory solutions. Cake mascara, once dry, had reasonable but not infallible staying power. Humidity, tears, sweat, or the unfortunate friction of rubbing one's eye could all produce the black smear beneath the lower lid that the beauty literature of the period called raccoon eye with visible dread. The solution most commonly recommended was a combination of careful application technique, not overloading the brush, working in thin layers, allowing each coat to fully dry before applying the next, and what was called the powder set technique, in which a light dusting of translucent face powder was applied over the dried mascara to absorb any residual oils and extend wear. Some women sealed their mascara with a thin coating of clear petroleum jelly applied with a fingertip, which added shine and also, they reported, made the lashes appear longer. The contemporary mascara Prima is the direct descendant of these improvised solutions. The false eyelash was the aspirational completion of the lash look in 1953, though at the drugstore price point it was a more occasional than daily accessory. Pre-made strip lashes, available from companies like Ardell's predecessors and several theatrical suppliers who had moved into the consumer market, cost between 50 cents and $1.50 for a pair that could be reused several times if cleaned carefully after each wearing. The adhesive that secured them was a separate purchase, a small tube of surgical latex-based glue available for around 25 cents, and the application process was considerably more challenging than the mascara procedure, requiring a steady hand and ideally a second person to check the alignment. False lashes in 1953 were worn for parties, for date nights, for special occasions that warranted the extra 45 minutes of getting ready they required. They were not, for most women, a daily tool. They were the punctuation mark at the end of a beauty sentence that had already been carefully composed. The lash landscape of today operates at a distance from the 1953 drugstore counter that is difficult to fully process. Tubing mascaras, fibre mascaras, waterproof mascaras, mascaras with patent-pending precision brush systems, semi-permanent lash extensions, magnetic lashes, lash lifts. The proliferation of options for the contemporary woman seeking to alter the appearance of her lashes is essentially unlimited and exists across every price point from $2 to $200. What has not changed is the fundamental goal: to make the lashes appear longer, darker, and more distinct, to frame the eye in a way that draws attention to it and communicates, through the specific grammar of feminine self-presentation that the woman wearing them has taken her own beauty seriously. The Maybelline cake tin is gone. The intention that animated it is not. The intersection of mascara culture and the social meaning of the gaze in 1953 is a territory that the beauty literature of the period approached through the language of attraction and self-presentation without fully theorizing what it was actually describing. The heavily mascaraed eye of the mid-century ideal was a legible cultural signal. It said that the woman wearing it had invested time and attention in the specific presentation of her eyes to the social world, that she understood the eyes to be communicative instruments as much as perceptual ones, and that she was choosing to amplify their impact through the tools the beauty market provided. The eye, in the visual grammar of 1953, was the most important feature of the feminine face. More flexible in its emotional register than the lips, more directly communicative than the cheek, the window through which the personality of the woman behind the cosmetics was supposed to be visible. The mascara brush itself in this era was a social artifact with a small but real etiquette attached to its use. Mascara was applied at home, at the vanity, as part of the morning routine. It was not refreshed in public in the way that lipstick was refreshed, both because the cake and brush application format did not lend itself to quick field use, and because the intimacy of the process, the close contact with the eye, the damp brush, the careful separation of lashes, was considered too private for the social restroom. A woman who removed a mascara cake and brush from her purse in a restaurant to touch up her eye makeup was committing a social gaffe of a specific kind. She was revealing too much of the mechanism behind the result, disrupting the social fiction that the face presented itself naturally, rather than being manufactured at the vanity and then maintained through the day with products and attention. The false eyelash market that existed at the margins of the 1953 drugstore beauty counter was beginning to develop the commercial infrastructure that would eventually make individual lash application a mainstream beauty practice rather than a theatrical specialty. The strip lashes available at drugstores and theatrical supply shops in this era were made from human hair or from the earlier synthetic fibre approximations of human hair, and they came in a range of densities from the relatively natural-looking, a single row of slightly longer and thicker lashes that blended with the natural lash line, to the frankly theatrical multi-row constructions that were designed for stage performance rather than social wear. The adhesive technology of the period was reliable enough for an evening's wear, but not sufficiently strong for extended daily use, and the removal process, soaking the lash strip in warm water to loosen the surgical latex glue, was delicate enough to damage the lash if rushed. The woman who wore false lashes to a dinner party in 1953 was making a significant investment of time and money and social courage, and she knew it, and so did the people who saw her. There was a war being fought at the bathroom sink in 1953, and most of the women washing their faces in it had no idea the battle lines had been drawn. On one side stood the dermatologists, the nascent skincare scientists, and a handful of forward-thinking beauty editors who had become convinced on the basis of growing clinical evidence that ordinary soap, alkaline, stripping, cheerfully scented, was actively damaging to the facial skin it was supposedly cleaning. On the other side stood generations of habit, the powerful advertising infrastructure of the American soap industry, the social conviction that cleanliness was the first virtue of femininity, and the practical fact that a bar of ivory soap cost 8 cents at any store in the country, and was therefore within reach of every woman regardless of her economic situation. The outcome of this conflict would shape the skincare industry for the next 7 decades. But in 1953, standing at the drugstore soap display with 40 cents in your hand, the choices available to you were both more limited and more interesting than the conflict's eventual resolution would suggest. The American soap market in 1953 was enormous, mature, and dominated by a small number of companies who had been selling their products with extraordinary consistency since the late 19th century. Ivory, produced by Procter & Gamble and advertised as being 99 and 44/100% pure, a claim whose precise meaning was never entirely clarified, but which communicated cleanliness with mathematical authority, was the best-selling bar soap in America, used for everything from washing dishes to washing babies to washing faces without any particular distinction being made between these applications. At 8 cents per bar, it was one of the cheapest cleaning products available. Palmolive, whose original formulation had included palm oil and olive oil, and whose advertisements had spent decades associating the brand with professional beauty advice. The famous campaign featuring endorsements from working beauticians was still running in various forms, was similarly priced and similarly positioned as an all-purpose soap appropriate for facial use. The specialized complexion soap category occupied a slightly elevated position in the drugstore display, priced between 25 cents and 60 cents per bar, and these products were where the marketing of the period became genuinely interesting. Woodbury's facial soap, one of the oldest and most aggressively advertised beauty products in American history, had been running its campaign built on the dermatologist endorsement model since the early 20th century. The Woodbury advertising of the 1920s and 30s had pioneered the use of sexually suggestive imagery in American print advertising. The famous "A Skin You Love to Touch" campaign was a landmark of early consumer advertising, and by 1953 the brand was selling a medicated complexion bar at 35 cents that promised, through a series of half-true claims about its sulfur content and pH balance, to actively treat the skin rather than merely clean it. Pimples, the ad suggested, could be addressed with Woodbury's consistent use. Blackheads could be minimized. The skin could be brought under control. Cashmere Bouquet, the Colgate-Palmolive entry in the complexion soap market, was targeting a slightly more aspirational buyer, the woman who wanted her bathroom shelf to speak of a certain femininity rather than mere hygiene. The soaps came wrapped in pastel paper printed with flower patterns and retailed for around 30 cents, smelled of clean white flowers, and lathered generously into a foam that felt luxurious even when it was, chemically speaking, doing essentially what ivory soap did for half the price. The phenomenon of the scented soap as both cleaning agent and sensory pleasure object was already well established by 1953, and Cashmere Bouquet was its exemplary drugstore expression. A woman who kept Cashmere Bouquet in her bathroom was sending a low-cost signal about her domestic aesthetic, her personal grooming standards, and her relationship to the language of feminine beauty culture. The counterweight to this entire soap culture was the cold cream cleansing method, which the previous decade's Hollywood studio system had endorsed so thoroughly that it had become the de facto alternative cleanser for women who were paying attention to the direction the beauty industry was beginning to move. Cold cream, Pond's in particular, worked on an oil-in-water emulsion principle that removed makeup and surface debris without the alkaline stripping action of soap, leaving a thin film of moisturizing oil on the skin rather than the tight, squeaky clean feeling that soap produced. Dermatologists who were beginning to publish popular articles in women's magazines in this period were coming down firmly on the side of cold cream as the preferable cleanser for facial skin, arguing that the temporary tightness women experienced after soap washing was not a sign of cleanliness, but a sign of barrier disruption. The skin's natural oil film, they explained, had been removed entirely, and the skin would spend the next several hours attempting to rebuild it. The women who read these articles and found them persuasive were ahead of a curve that the mainstream beauty industry would not fully acknowledge for another 2 decades. The acne problem, which 1953 called by several names, blemishes, complexion trouble, problem skin, was the great selling proposition of the medicated soap category and of several standalone spot treatment products that sat on the drugstore shelf nearby. Cuticura medicated soap at 30 cents per bar contained sulfur and other antiseptic agents and was positioned explicitly as a treatment product for troubled skin. Its smell was distinctive, slightly medicinal, faintly eggy from the sulfur content, and it lathered into a somewhat thinner foam than luxury complexion soaps, a sensory difference that its advocates argued was evidence of its therapeutic seriousness. Stridex, which would eventually become one of the most popular acne treatment products in American history, was not yet a major retail presence in 1953, but the medicated astringent pads that would inspire its later development were available at drugstores under various private label brand names for around 50 cents per bottle. The racial politics of the complexion soap market in 1953 were explicit and systematically codified in a way that is difficult to look at directly without considerable discomfort. The ideal complexion promised by virtually every soap advertisement in the mainstream market was a specific shade of pale, flawless, translucent white skin, the complexion of a woman like Grace Kelly, whose wedding to Prince Rainier was already being anticipated by the American press despite being 2 years away. Products marketed to black women operated in a separate retail universe, typically sold through separate distribution channels and in some regions through separate pharmacy sections, and they frequently included skin-lightening agents. Hydroquinone was already in limited use, as were various mercury-containing preparations that were not yet widely recognized as dangerous in their formulations. The Nadinola bleaching cream, sold at both black-owned pharmacies and certain mainstream drugstores, represented the far end of a market built entirely on the premise that darker skin was a complexion problem requiring correction. The psychic damage this market did to the women it targeted is not a historical footnote, but a central chapter of the period's beauty narrative. The water in which all of this soap was dissolved was itself a variable that the beauty literature of the period tracked with some anxiety. Hard water, water with high mineral content, which described the tap water in large portions of the American Midwest and South, interacted badly with bar soap, producing the soap curd that left a dull film on skin and created the bathtub ring that was a persistent domestic complaint. Soft water, by contrast, allowed soap to lather freely and rinse completely, leaving skin feeling genuinely clean. The solution sold at drugstores was water-softening soap bars with added EDTA or citric acid to bind the minerals, and several brands, Zest was the most prominent, introduced by Procter & Gamble in 1952 and advertised heavily in the following year, built their entire identity on the promise of a soap that worked equally well in hard and soft water and left no curd, no film, no compromise. Zest advertising of this period is some of the most technically specific beauty advertising of the decade, featuring cross-sectional diagrams of soap molecules and confident declarations about water chemistry that were simultaneously accurate and designed to make the consumer feel she was purchasing a scientific solution rather than a toilet product. The contemporary skincare world has arrived after 7 decades of debate at something close to the position the dermatologists of 1953 were beginning to stake out, that the facial skin requires cleansing, but that the cleansing agent should respect the barrier rather than strip it, should clean without alkaline disruption, should leave the skin prepared for what comes next rather than depleted and defensive. The micellar waters, the gel cleansers, the cream cleansers, the oil cleansers, all of them are answers to the same problem that the women washing their faces with ivory soap in 1953 were experiencing without necessarily having the vocabulary to name it. The soap is largely gone from the skincare conversation, relegated to the body and the hands. But the conversation it catalyzed about what the face actually needs and what we owe it as its caretakers has never stopped. The influence of the war years on the soap habits of the American woman in 1953 is a thread that runs beneath the surface of the complexion soap market without being acknowledged in any of the advertising or beauty column coverage of the period. The wartime rationing of fats and oils, the raw materials from which soap was made, had created genuine shortages of quality soap between 1942 and 1945, and the response of the soap industry had been to stretch formulations, increase filler content, and prioritize functional cleaning performance over the luxury properties of scent and skin feel. Women who had been managing their complexion soap needs during the war years with whatever was available had developed, out of necessity, a flexibility about brand loyalty and a practical approach to the cleansing ritual that the post-war abundance of 1953 was now transforming back into a context for aesthetic preference and brand aspiration. The return to abundance was itself a selling point that the soap manufacturers leveraged. The ability to choose your complexion soap, to select the fragrance and the texture and the brand story that suited you, was a small but genuine marker of the freedom that the post-war consumer economy was understood to represent. The alkalinity question that underpinned the dermatological critique of soap cleansing in the early 50s was more complex in its practical dimensions than the beauty column summaries suggested. The pH of the skin surface, the acid mantle, a term that was beginning to appear in the more scientifically oriented beauty coverage of the period, was approximately 5 to 6, slightly acidic, a condition maintained by the combination of sebum, sweat, and the natural breakdown products of skin cell metabolism that coated the surface. A bar soap formulated at a pH of 9 to 10, which was standard for the period's cleansers, disrupted this acid mantle every time it was applied. The disruption was temporary. The skin restored its normal pH within 30 minutes to 2 hours of washing, depending on individual skin type and environmental conditions. But daily repetition of this disruption had cumulative effects, particularly in women whose skin was naturally dry or sensitive. The dermatologists who were beginning to publish in popular magazines on this subject were not working from theoretical models, but from clinical observation of their patients' skin conditions, and the connection they were drawing between daily soap use and chronic dry skin, reactive skin, and impaired barrier function was real and would eventually reshape the entire cleansing product category. The relationship between cleansing habits and the climate in which a woman lived was a variable that the beauty literature of 1953 addressed inconsistently. Women living in the humid climate zones of the American South and Southeast, where the skin's natural moisture level was maintained by the ambient humidity, experienced soap stripping differently from women in the dry continental climates of the Midwest and Mountain West. In the dry climates, the combination of low humidity air, central heating in winter, and daily soap washing created the conditions for the most severe cleansing-induced dryness, the tight, uncomfortable, visibly flaky skin that drove women toward the more emollient cleansing alternatives that were beginning to appear in the market. The same soap that a woman in New Orleans used daily without consequence could produce significant discomfort in her counterpart in Denver, but the beauty advice of the period did not systematically account for these regional variations, preferring instead to offer universal protocols that were applied to highly variable individual situations. For 39 cents, a woman in 1953 could purchase a colour that would change how she felt about herself for the next 3 months. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a commercial fact documented in sales records, beauty column correspondence, and the advertising budgets of companies like Revlon, Tangy, and Hazel Bishop, who collectively spent more money convincing American women that lipstick was a psychological necessity than they spent on nearly any other product in their lines. The drugstore lipstick counter of 1953 was one of the great democratic institutions of the post-war consumer economy, a place where a woman with 40 cents could stand beside a woman with $4 and leave with essentially the same thing. A colour on her lips that the culture of her decade had agreed was the single most important cosmetic investment a woman could make in her own appearance. The lipstick in her purse was her most public ornament, her most frequently refreshed cosmetic, and in the specific emotional economy of the 1950s, one of the few objects she owned and used that belonged entirely to the cultivation of her own image, rather than the management of someone else's comfort. The lipstick market at the drugstore level in 1953 was organised around a handful of key brands whose competition for shelf space and consumer loyalty produced some of the most memorable advertising in the history of American beauty marketing. Revlon had spent the previous several years transforming the lipstick category with its matching nail enamel and lipstick sets, introduced in the early 1940s, that proposed the idea of the coordinated beauty look as an achievable consumer product rather than a professional stylistic decision. By 1953, Revlon's drugstore lipstick line, which paralleled the department store line in formula, if not always in packaging quality, included shades like Bachelor's Carnation, a warm, slightly orange-toned red that would read as deeply autumnal by contemporary standards but was utterly current in 1953, and Pink Lightning, a coral pink that was slightly softer in statement than the power reds, but that the advertising positioned as equally sophisticated. Hazel Bishop had launched her indelible lipstick in 1950, and by 1953 it had become one of the most significant product innovations in the mass-market beauty industry. Bishop, a chemist who had worked at the Standard Oil Development Company before turning her research focus to cosmetic chemistry, had solved what was genuinely the great practical problem of lipstick in her era. It wore off too quickly. A woman who applied lipstick in the morning would find it largely gone by 10 o'clock, consumed by her morning coffee and the first hour of whatever her day involved. The ritual of lipstick reapplication was therefore constant and expected, built into the social schedule of the period in the same way that pocket watch winding had been built into the schedule of the previous century. Hazel Bishop's formula, a combination of acetoglycerin and other film-forming agents that created a lasting film on the lip surface, did not eliminate this reapplication entirely, but it extended wear dramatically. Her advertising claim, "It stays on you, not on him," was one of the most effective pieces of beauty copy written in the decade, managing simultaneously to address the practical problem of wear and to inject a note of intimate romance into what was otherwise a chemistry story. Tangy, whose claim to fame since its 1920s launch had been the colour-changing technology that caused its lipstick to shift from orange in the tube to a personalised rose on the wearer's lips, occupied a specific and enduring market position that its competitors could not easily replicate. Tangy's natural shade, the original colour adapter, was particularly beloved by women who were nervous about lipstick, who had been raised by mothers who considered visible cosmetics slightly vulgar, or who worked in environments where dramatic makeup was considered inappropriate. The Tangy Natural gave these women a lip colour that could be described with complete accuracy as natural looking on the mouth, because it genuinely was. The colour it produced on any given woman's lips was the product of that woman's own lip chemistry interacting with the dye in the formula, producing a rose or pink that was uniquely hers. This was brilliant marketing, and also, unusually for the period, a genuinely true product claim. The physical format of the Drugstore lipstick bullet in 1953 deserves attention because it was already the mature, standardized format we would recognize today. The swivel-up mechanism, the angled top, the cylindrical metal or plastic tube, the slim silhouette designed to fit in a small purse or a coat pocket. But the formula inside differed from contemporary lipstick in ways that affected both the sensory experience and the performance. 1953 lipsticks were built on a base of beeswax, carnauba wax and castor oil, with relatively low concentrations of synthetic wax polymers compared to modern formulas, and this meant that they were softer at body temperature, more prone to mushrooming out of the tube if left in a warm car, more susceptible to the gentle deformation that happened when the bullet was pressed against the angled flat of the lip for application. The trade-off was a creamier, more emollient application feel, and a slight sheerness that even full coverage shades exhibited, caused by the castor oil's natural light diffusing properties. Contemporary lipsticks, with their higher synthetic wax content and advanced polymer films, are more stable, more precisely pigmented, and often less comfortable on the lip. The social grammar of red lipstick selection in 1953 was a topic that beauty editors addressed regularly, because the range of available reds was already wide enough that the question of which red was correct for a given woman had real significance. The basic taxonomy divided reds into blue-based, which were the cool crimsons and cherries, and orange-based, which were the warmer scarlets and fire-engine tones, with a large contested middle ground of true reds that could read either way depending on context. Fair-skinned women were steered toward the blue-based reds, which had become associated with the Grace Kelly school of restraint and cool elegance. Olive and darker-skinned women were sometimes told the orange-based reds would suit them better, advice that was partially correct in its underlying colour theory, and thoroughly scrambled by the implicit assumption that all women were aiming for the same archetypal look with different starting points. The beauty editors who dispensed this advice were working within the visual vocabulary of their era, which was a vocabulary with limited range and a tendency to mistake convention for truth. The texture hierarchy within drugstore lipsticks tracked almost perfectly with price. At the bottom of the range, the Woolworth's private label and the cheapest tangy options at around 25 to 35 cents, the formula was drier, less emollient, and had a tendency to settle into the fine lines of the lips by midday in a way that became visible enough to require reapplication. In the 35 to 65 cent range, which is where most of the major branded products sat, the formula improved enough to be genuinely comfortable for 4 to 6 hours of wear. Above 65 cents, you were beginning to approach the department store lipstick quality at drugstore prices, and certain products in the Hazel Bishop range and the higher-end Max Factor line did genuinely compete with the department store formulas on raw quality while remaining accessible by price. This compressed quality ladder was one of the defining features of the 1953 drugstore beauty market and was the thing that made it, for millions of American women, the most democratic beauty institution available. The liner question, whether to use a lip liner to define the lip before applying lipstick, was already present in 1953, but was not the universal prerequisite it would become in subsequent decades. Lip liners were available at the drugstore counter at around 30 cents, sold in pencil form or in small brush-on-pot form, and their use was recommended primarily for women whose natural lip line was uneven or who wanted to create the slightly more defined, slightly larger lip shape that the period's ideal demanded. The techniques described in beauty manuals of the period for lip lining would strike the contemporary reader as remarkably elaborate. Drawing the Cupid's bow with a liner slightly outside the natural lip line, filling in the corners to correct any asymmetry, then applying the lipstick within this defined border in deliberate strokes, rather than the single swipe that most women actually used. The goal was a lip that read as perfectly symmetrical and clearly defined even across a room, which was the standard against which the 1953 face was constantly measured. The contemporary lip market is, by the standards of 1953, an almost incomprehensible abundance. Liquid lipsticks, lip stains, lip oils, tinted balms, transfer-proof mattes, vinyl glosses, colour-changing formulas, gradient techniques, ombre lips. The range of products and the stylistic possibilities they enable would have struck the woman standing at the Rexall counter in 1953 as belonging to a different civilization entirely. And yet, she would have recognized, immediately, and without any translation required, the transaction taking place at the contemporary Sephora lip display. A woman picking up a bullet of colour, twisting it up, looking at it against the light, imagining it on her own mouth, trying to decide whether this particular red, this particular rose, this particular coral is the one that will make her look exactly like herself, only more so. The economic relationship between lipstick and the national mood is a connection that historians of the consumer economy have documented in enough cases to treat as a reliable phenomenon rather than a coincidence. The so-called lipstick index, the observation that lipstick sales tend to rise during economic downturns as consumers trade down from larger luxury purchases to affordable indulgences, was not named as such in 1953, but its underlying logic was already visible to the cosmetics industry's marketing analysts, who had watched lipstick sales hold steady or increase through the Depression years and the wartime rationing period, and had concluded that the lipstick was recession-proof in a way that most consumer goods were not. By 1953, operating in an economy of post-war prosperity rather than wartime constraint, the lipstick market was at something close to its historical peak, but the industry's understanding of why women bought lipstick, its function as affordable self-expression in times of constraint, as well as affordable luxury in times of prosperity, was built into the pricing and marketing architecture of every major brand. The texture evolution within the 1953 drugstore lipstick market was moving, almost imperceptibly to the consumer at the time, in a direction that would eventually transform the entire category. The standard cream formula that dominated the market in this era, beeswax, carnauba wax, castor oil, pigment, was beginning to face competition from formulas that incorporated newer synthetic wax polymers and polymethyl methacrylate-based pearl particles that created both a slightly different application feel and a more stable pigment deposit on the lip surface. These were not revolutionary changes in 1953, they were incremental refinements, but they point toward the trajectory that would eventually produce the long-wear, transfer-resistant lipstick formulas of the late 20th century. The consumer of 1953 who found one brand's formula more comfortable or more durable than another's was responding to real formula differences, even if she lacked the technical vocabulary to describe what she was experiencing. The cultural authority that the motion picture industry exercised over lipstick colour preferences in 1953 was direct and documentable. When a major film released in the autumn of 1953 featured its female star in a particular shade of lipstick, and the film magazines that covered Hollywood in exhaustive detail typically included items about the makeup used in major productions, sourced from Max Factor's publicity department, the retail demand for that shade at the drugstore counter increased within weeks of the film's release. This feedback loop between Hollywood production and consumer market was one of the defining features of the mid-century beauty industry, operating through the fan magazine and the women's magazine, and the beauty counter demonstration in a chain of influence that ran from the studio makeup chair to the drugstore shelf, to the vanity table of a woman in Akron, Ohio, who had seen the film on Saturday and was standing at the Rexall counter on Monday morning looking for the colour her favourite actress had been wearing. Charles Revson understood something about desire that most of his competitors did not, and the proof of his understanding arrived in the 1953 drugstore nail polish display with the clarity of a demonstration. Revlon's nail enamel shades were not given functional names, not number 7 red or deep pink Formula B. They were given names that were small, self-contained fantasies. Cherries in the Snow, Fire and Ice, Bachelor's Carnation. These names did not describe the colour in any precise way. They evoked an emotional state, a social situation, a version of a woman's life that was marginally more vivid and romantically charged than the life she was actually living on a Tuesday in suburban Ohio. And women paid 35 to 50 cents at the drugstore counter for this evocation, and went home and painted their nails and felt while doing so something adjacent to the fantasy embedded in the name. This is either a magnificent or a cynical achievement in consumer marketing, possibly both simultaneously, and it reshaped the American nail polish market so completely that the naming conventions Revson introduced in the 1940s were still the industry standard in 1953 and remain essentially unchanged today. Nail enamel in 1953 was a product with a recent but already complicated history. The modern nitrocellulose lacquer nail polish, the formula that had replaced the earlier tinted nail creams and buffing powders of the 19th century, had been commercially available since roughly the 1920s, pioneered by the same automotive paint technology that had given the world durable, colour-stable coatings for car bodies. The connection between nail lacquer and automobile paint is not incidental. The nitrocellulose and plasticizers that made a Model T's surface gleam and resist the weather were essentially the same chemistry, scaled down and perfumed, that a woman applied to her fingernails. By 1953, this heritage was invisible. The product had been fully domesticated and feminized, but the chemical reality of what a woman was painting onto her nails was a tiny coat of the same industrial lacquer technology that finished the Chevrolet parked in her driveway. The Revlon empire at the drugstore level was extensive by 1953 and covered nail enamel, lipstick, and the matching sets that the company had popularized as its central commercial strategy. Since Charles Revson had the insight that the department store beauty counter could be organized not around individual products, but around coordinated looks. The matching nail and lip concept. You bought the lipstick in Bachelor's Carnation and the nail enamel in the same shade, and you wore them together, and the coordination of your hand colour to your lip colour demonstrated a level of grooming intentionality that the decade's beauty culture considered the mark of a seriously put-together woman, was a retail innovation that created an entirely new category of impulse purchase. At the drugstore, the Revlon display typically featured small promotional cards showing the pairing, and the card itself functioned as a miniature style consultation, telling the uncertain buyer exactly what to do with her money. Cutex, owned by Northam Warren and one of the oldest nail polish brands in American history, held a significant drugstore position alongside Revlon in 1953 and competed primarily on breadth of shade selection and the reliability of its formula. Cutex polish dried slightly faster than some competitors, a selling point that women who painted their nails as the last step before leaving the house understood immediately. The Cutex advertising of the period was less aspirationally charged than Revlon's, less invested in the fantasy of the colour name, more focused on the practical virtues of the product, but the brand retained a loyal following among women who had been buying it since before the war and trusted its consistency. At 30 cents for a standard bottle, Cutex sat slightly below Revlon in price and positioned itself as the reliable workhorse of the nail enamel market rather than the glamorous frontrunner. The application ritual was its own complicated and somewhat meditative practice. A woman in 1953 who was going to paint her nails properly, not a quick single coat before dinner, but the full procedure described in the beauty manuals, would begin by removing any existing polish with a cotton ball soaked in polish remover, which in this era was predominantly an acetone-based product that worked quickly and efficiently and smelled strongly enough to require ventilation. The nail surface would then be buffed lightly to remove any shine and create a key for the polish to adhere to, a technique borrowed directly from the painter's trade of surface preparation. A base coat, thin, colourless, and formulated to bond to the nail surface and create a smooth foundation, would go on first, followed by 2 coats of colour applied in the 3-stroke method the beauty editors described with consistency. 1 stroke down the centre of the nail from base to tip, 1 stroke on the left side, 1 on the right. The top coat, applied over the dried colour to add shine and extend wear, completed the procedure. Total time, approximately 25 minutes to do both hands, plus drying time, which could be extended by brief submersion in cold water, a technique that set the lacquer faster without compromising the finish. The drying time problem was the great practical annoyance of 1953 nail enamel and generated a small product category of its own, the nail drying spray and the quick dry drop, both available at the drugstore for around 25 to 35 cents, that claimed to reduce drying time from 15 minutes to 5. These products worked inconsistently. The drying sprays were more effective than the drops, but even the best of them could not entirely eliminate the window of vulnerability during which a freshly polished nail, touched by anything at all, would retain the fingerprint or surface mark of that contact. Women who painted their nails developed an elaborate set of waiting strategies, keeping the hands flat on a table surface, avoiding picking up anything for the duration of the drying period, turning book pages with the pads of the fingers rather than the nails. These accommodations were considered a normal part of the beauty routine rather than an unreasonable burden, which tells you something about the degree to which the period's beauty standards were built around the expectation that women would accommodate significant inconvenience in the service of their appearance. The economic relationship between nail colour and social status was more compressed and democratic at the drugstore price point than it was at the department store counter, but it was not entirely absent. Clear polish, or very pale pink, read as appropriate for working women in professional office environments where visible grooming was valued but dramatic decoration was not. Bright red read as confident, socially active, aware of one's own attractiveness, the colour of a woman going somewhere that evening. Dark shades, deep burgundy, almost black plum, were emerging in 1953 as the avant-garde edge of the nail enamel market, worn by women who read fashion magazines attentively and considered themselves ahead of rather than behind the aesthetic curve. The connection between nail colour and the social reading of the woman wearing it was tight enough that beauty columns regularly advised their readers on shade selection for specific social situations: pale pink for the job interview, medium rose for the dinner party, deep red for the theatre. The tools that accompanied nail enamel were their own small economy at the drugstore counter. Emery boards, which had replaced metal nail files in popular use by the early 50s because they were cheaper and disposable, cost 5 cents for a pack of 3. The orange stick, a wooden implement used to push back cuticles and clean under the nail edge, was available for 10 cents per pack of 6. Cuticle Remover Cream, a mildly caustic formula that softened and dissolved the dead skin at the nail base to allow clean cuticle management, retailed for around 20 cents per small tube. The Nail Buffer, a small chamois-covered block used to create a natural shine on bare nails by friction, was available for 15 cents and produced on a properly filed and buffed nail a surface luster that some women preferred to any coloured product. These accessories turned the nail enamel routine into a complete system with its own dedicated tools, and the woman who assembled the full set was investing, in total, across all these products, somewhere between $1 and $1.50 in the infrastructure of a polished hand. The contemporary nail industry is a global economy worth tens of billions of dollars, and the aesthetic vocabulary it operates in, the names of the shades, the emphasis on colour coordination with other cosmetics, the ritual of the manicure as an act of self-care rather than merely grooming, traces its ancestry directly to the drugstore nail display of 1953. A contemporary woman scrolling through a brand's online shade range and pausing at a colour called something like Cherries in the Snow or Fire and Ice is engaging in exactly the same act of imaginative self-projection that Charles Revson designed the naming conventions to produce. The specific technology of the lacquer has evolved, gel formulas, dip powder systems, long-wear acrylics, but the psychological architecture of the purchase has not changed at all. A woman buying nail colour is buying a small, affordable, portable piece of the life she's imagining for herself, and no amount of reformulation changes what that is. The professional manicure that existed in 1953 as the elevated alternative to the home nail care ritual occupied a specific social position in the landscape of women's personal spending. Beauty parlours, the term salon was not yet the dominant usage, typically offered manicure services as an add-on to the hair appointment, and the price of a professional manicure in 1953 ranged from about 60 cents to $1.50, depending on the neighbourhood and the quality of the establishment. A woman who got a professional manicure every 2 weeks was spending between $15 and $40 annually on her nails alone, which at the household income levels of the early 50s represented a non-trivial discretionary expenditure. Most women managed their nails at home most of the time and treated the professional manicure as a special occasion service, reserved for weddings, formal events, or the once-monthly visit that the etiquette literature recommended as the minimum standard for a woman who took her appearance seriously. The colour coordination mandate that Revlon had introduced into the nail enamel market, the idea that the lip colour and nail colour should match or at minimum harmonise within the same colour family, had by 1953 created a secondary market in shade-matching anxiety that the beauty columns addressed regularly. A woman who owned 4 shades of nail enamel and 6 shades of lipstick needed to understand which pairings were correct and which were discordant, and the permutations were enough to generate genuine uncertainty. The solution that Revlon's own marketing literature offered, buy the matching set, eliminate the uncertainty, was commercially elegant but not universally affordable, since it required purchasing both products from the same brand in the same shade, doubling the expenditure. Women who mixed brands and shades navigated this problem with varying degrees of success, and the beauty column reader's mail of the period included a steady stream of questions about whether this particular coral lipstick worked with that particular red nail enamel, or whether the slight difference in undertone was visible and therefore a problem. The hardener category at the drugstore nail counter was small but growing in 1953, addressing the specific problem of nail brittleness and breakage, that affected a significant proportion of the women the market was targeting. Nail hardening preparations typically contained formaldehyde as their active agent, the same chemistry that was used in wood hardening and textile finishing, applied in small concentrations to the nail surface in a colourless formula. The safety profile of formaldehyde at cosmetic concentrations was not a subject of public discussion in 1953, though it would become one in subsequent decades, and the products were sold without particular caution about the cumulative effects of regular formaldehyde exposure on the nail and skin. Women who used hardening preparations regularly noticed that their nails grew longer without breaking, that the nail surface became slightly stiffer and more resistant to the mechanical stresses of household work, and they generally reported this as an improvement. The trade-off in nail flexibility that heavy formaldehyde treatment produced, nails that became brittle in a different way, the rigidity that snapped rather than bent, was a side effect that revealed itself over months rather than weeks, and was not consistently attributed to the hardener by the women experiencing it. The hair section at the corner drugstore in 1953 occupied roughly 4 linear feet of shelf space, and contained, within those 4 feet, the complete infrastructure for a domestic hair care practice that was in some ways more chemically sophisticated and more technically demanding than anything the contemporary consumer beauty market has produced. To look at the shelf was to understand immediately that the hair of the American woman in 1953 was a serious project, a regularly scheduled undertaking with its own dedicated tools, chemistry and protocols, managed not at a salon, though the salon existed and was used for special occasions, but at home by the woman herself, working with products that her drugstore carried for under 50 cents each, and that she had been buying, with minor variations in brand preference, for a decade. The Toni Home Permanent had entered the market in 1947, and by 1953 had sold to an estimated 30 million American women, making it one of the most commercially successful beauty products of the entire post-war decade. The wave set in its various forms was on the shelf next to it. The rinse, the shampoo, the brilliantine, the setting lotion, all of them within arm's reach, all of them under $1. The shampoo category at the 1953 drugstore did not look like the contemporary shampoo aisle in any meaningful way. The dominant product formats were liquid concentrates in small glass bottles that produced relatively modest lather compared to the contemporary consumer's expectation. The sulfate-heavy formulas that create abundant foam were not yet universal, and many 1953 shampoos were formulated around soapwort or Castile soap bases that lathered quietly and thoroughly without the theatrical foam that post-war advertising would come to associate with clean. Halo shampoo, manufactured by Colgate-Palmolive, and advertised with the tagline "Glorifies your hair," was one of the best-selling shampoos in the drugstore market at 25 cents for a standard bottle. Dreen, produced by Procter & Gamble and one of the first synthetic detergent shampoos, meaning it used synthetic surfactants rather than soap-based cleansers, giving it better performance in hard water, was another major presence at around 30 cents. Both were designed for weekly or bi-weekly use, which was the standard washing frequency for most American women in this era. A schedule that now sounds infrequent, but made complete sense in the context of hairstyles that required significant architectural investment to create and maintain. The washing frequency question connects directly to the entire ecology of the 1953 drugstore hair section. A woman who set her hair in pin curls or on rollers, as the majority of American women with any investment in their appearance did, typically washed her hair once or twice a week, and then managed the style's survival through the intervening days using dry shampoos, setting mist refreshers, and careful sleeping habits involving the pin curl maintenance that the hair sections of magazines documented with the precision of technical manuals. Dry shampoo in 1953 was not the aerosol spray product that contemporary consumers recognize. It was typically a powder, either purchased as a cosmetic product at around 20 cents per box or assembled from cornstarch at home, applied to the roots, worked through with the fingers, and then brushed out, taking the excess sebum with it, and refreshing the style enough to extend another day or two before a full wash became necessary. The modern aerosol dry shampoo that has become a beauty staple is the direct technological descendant of this powder product, with the delivery mechanism updated but the underlying principle unchanged. The setting lotion was perhaps the most essential product in the 1953 hair styling toolkit, and its position on the drugstore shelf reflected that centrality. Setting lotion, sold under brand names including Lilt, which also made home permanents, and Bobby, and several private label formulations, was applied to clean, damp hair before rolling or pinning, providing a light hold that helped the set maintain its shape during the drying period and carry through into the finished style. The formulas were predominantly water-based with small amounts of natural gum, Coria gum, gum tragacanth, that coated the hair shaft and provided a film of hold without the stiffness or residue of heavier styling products. At around 25 cents per bottle, setting lotion was one of the lower cost items in the drugstore hair section, but it was essentially non-optional for women who were investing the time and effort of a formal set in their hair. Without it, the set fell faster. The wave lost its definition by afternoon, and the entire procedure of the previous evening was partially wasted. The brilliantine and hairdressing category occupied another section of the hair shelf and served a distinct set of purposes from the setting products. Brilliantine, an oil-based product applied in small amounts to dry hair to add shine, tame frizz, and provide a smooth finish, had been a staple of the American grooming market since the early 20th century. By 1953, the format had evolved to include both the traditional oil-based brilliantines and the newer cream-based hairdressings that provided similar shine benefits with less weight and a cleaner feel. Dixie Peach, Murray's Superior Hairdressing, and Brylcreem, which was positioned primarily as a men's product but used by many women for specific styling applications, were the major brands in this category, priced between 25 and 50 cents per tin or tube. The cultural association between these products and specific racial and ethnic beauty communities was strong enough that the drugstore display organized them in ways that mapped, without disguise, onto the store's customer demographics, a kind of commercial segregation that replicated in the beauty aisle the social segregation of the surrounding community. The home permanent market of 1953 was its own entire economy, operating within the hair section, and the Toni permanent kit, at $1.25 for the complete set, was its central offering. A Toni home permanent contained everything required to produce a professional quality wave on home-washed hair. The waving lotion, the neutralizer, the end papers, the plastic rods in various sizes. The procedure required approximately 2 to 3 hours, a considerable commitment of time and attention, and involved applying the waving lotion, an alkaline solution of ammonium thioglycolate, to the wound hair rods, allowing it to act on the hair's disulfide bonds for the time specified on the instructions, then applying the neutralizer to reform those bonds in the new, curled configuration. The chemistry was the same chemistry used in professional salons. The Toni packaging simply put it in the hands of the woman at home rather than the operator at the salon chair. This democratization of professional hair chemistry was one of the genuinely significant consumer developments of the post-war decade, and was recognized as such by the beauty industry, which responded with competitive panic from professional salon operators and enthusiastic expansion from the home permanent kit manufacturers. The hair colour section of the drugstore in 1953 was smaller and more cautiously stocked than it would become in subsequent decades, because the home hair colour market was still operating under the shadow of a cultural attitude that treated artificial hair colour as a confession of age, of vanity, of a kind of social ambition that proper women were not supposed to acknowledge too openly. The products available for home colour were predominantly the temporary rinse type, products like Nestle Colorins and Rue Fanciful Rinse, which coated the hair with a water-soluble dye that would wash out completely in the next shampoo, allowing a woman to experiment with slightly deeper or brighter tones without committing to anything permanent. These rinses were priced at around 50 cents per bottle and were used primarily by women with grey hair who wanted to temporarily restore the appearance of their natural colour, or by women with naturally brown hair who wanted to add warmth or highlights before a special occasion. The more permanent oxidative colour products, the hydrogen peroxide and dye formulas that would become the backbone of the home colour market in the 1960s following Clairol's revolutionary Does She or Doesn't She advertising campaign, were available but were still predominantly sold through professional channels because the stigma attached to visible home colour remained strong enough that most women preferred the cover of the salon to the exposure of the bathroom. The contemporary hair care aisle is a supernova compared to the 4 linear feet of the 1953 drugstore, containing hundreds of products organised by hair type, hair concern, hair texture, and treatment goal in a taxonomic complexity that would have bewildered the 1953 shopper. But the underlying needs being served are identical. Clean hair, manageable hair, hair that holds a style, hair that has enough shine to read as healthy, hair that is the correct colour for the woman who wears it, hair that cooperates with the social expectations placed upon it. The Halo shampoo and the contemporary sulfate-free cleanser are solving the same problem with 70 years of intervening chemistry between them. The ambition is unchanged. The drugstore shelf remains the place where most women address it. The professional haircare market that existed in 1953 as the elevated tier above the drugstore hair section was itself a complex economy, with its own class markers, racial geography, and marketing conventions that interacted in complicated ways with the drugstore products that were simultaneously referencing the professional world and making it accessible to the home user. The beauty parlour operator of 1953 and the industry used the term operator rather than stylist, a usage that emphasised the technical and professional nature of the work, had trained for a minimum of 1 year at a licensed cosmetology school and held a state licence that authorised her to practice. She used professional-grade products that were, in most cases, not available for retail purchase at the drugstore, and she was paid not only for the chemistry she applied to her client's hair, but for the cutting, setting, and finishing skills that determined the shape of the finished style. The Toni Home Permanent Kit that a woman could buy at the drugstore for $1.25 gave her access to the same chemistry the professional used, but it could not give her the cutting and setting skills that determined whether that chemistry produced a soft, professional-looking wave or a slightly off, visibly home-done approximation. The racial geography of the professional haircare market in 1953 was as sharply drawn as the racial geography of every other public service industry in an America that was, in 1953, still formally segregated in much of the South and informally segregated in most of the North. Black-owned beauty parlours operated in a separate professional world from the white-owned establishments that served the white market, used products sourced from separate distributors, companies like Madam C.J. Walker's business, which had become a major supplier of professional-grade hair care products for black women since the early 20th century, and developed their own technical vocabulary and their own aesthetic conventions around the specific challenges and possibilities of black hair textures that the white professional market did not address and largely did not acknowledge. The Walker Company and its competitors sold to both professional operators and directly to consumers through mail order and through black-owned pharmacies, and their product lines, pressing oils, conditioning treatments, straightening preparations, reflected a technical understanding of the actual diversity of human hair texture that the mainstream drugstore market was not yet equipped to serve. The setting lotion chemistry of 1953 was the beginning of what would become, over the following 3 decades, an increasingly complex polymer science of hold and body in styling products. The natural gum bases that dominated the 1953 market, Coria, Tragacanth, Acacia, were water-soluble and biodegradable but relatively limited in the strength and longevity of the hold they could provide. The synthetic polymer PVP, polyvinyl pyrrolidone, had been developed during the Second World War as a blood plasma extender and found its way into hairstyling products in the early 1950s, where its film-forming properties proved ideal for a stronger, cleaner hold than the natural gums could deliver. PVP would eventually become one of the foundational polymers of the modern hairstyling product industry, the backbone of countless gels, mousses and sprays. But in 1953 it was just beginning to appear in the formulations of the more technologically progressive styling products on the drugstore shelf, present enough to affect performance without yet being standard. The face of a properly made-up woman in 1953 was matte. This was not a matter of preference or stylistic choice. It was a nearly universal aesthetic requirement, as fixed in the beauty grammar of the period as the rule against wearing white shoes after Labor Day, or the prohibition against visible bra straps. The shine-free face was the correctly finished face, and the product responsible for achieving and maintaining it was face powder, applied over foundation in the morning and refreshed throughout the day with a compact puff as often as the social situation and the individual woman's sebaceous glands required. The face powder market at the drugstore in 1953 was one of the largest single product categories in the beauty section, dominated by a few major brands who competed primarily on shade range, texture, and the marketing of the powder's specific finishing effect, from sheer translucency to heavy coverage to what certain brands called invisible, a shade theoretically matched to every skin tone simultaneously, which in practice meant a pale beige that worked reasonably well for the light-skinned women who were the assumed universal consumer. Coty's air-spun loose powder was the category's legendary artifact. Introduced in 1933 and continuously produced without significant formula change through 1953 and beyond, air-spun was a talc-based powder milled to a fineness that the company had spent years perfecting, resulting in a texture so light that it settled onto the skin with almost no perceptible weight, covering minor imperfections and setting the foundation beneath it without obscuring the complexion entirely. The packaging was equally iconic, a round cardboard box printed in the brand's characteristic deep blue and gold, sealed with a paper tape that a woman pulled back on first purchase, inside which sat the powder and a dense velour puff slightly smaller than the palm of a hand. At 60 cents per box, airspun was not the cheapest loose powder available. Drugstore private label powders could be found for 25 cents, but it was widely considered to offer the best texture to price ratio in the mass market, and it had the additional advantage of a shade range that included, by 1953, around 14 options covering the spectrum from very fair to light tan, which was a more generous range than many of its competitors offered. The shade range problem was endemic to the drugstore powder market of 1953, and reflected with uncomfortable precision the same assumptions about the intended consumer that structured the rest of the beauty industry. The standard Coty airspun shade lineup in this era ran from translucent, intended for very pale skins and providing essentially no coverage, only a matte finish, through natural blush beige and flesh, all of which clustered in the light to medium range, to Rachel, which was a deeper beige originally named after the Rachel cream of the 18th century French theatre tradition, and which sat as the darkest shade in most mainstream powder lines of the period. Below Rachel, the options became sparse or disappeared entirely. Women with darker skin tones who shopped at the mainstream drugstore had limited options, were frequently advised by beauty editors to use their existing shade and simply blend with greater care, and in practice often mix shades themselves or purchase from specialty suppliers who understood the actual breadth of the human complexion spectrum. This was not a niche problem or a minor inconvenience. It was a systematic market failure that persisted, with only incremental improvement, for decades. Max Factor's pancake powder, an extension of the studio makeup format that Factor had developed in the 1930s to solve the specific challenges of Technicolor film, had crossed entirely into the consumer market by 1953 and was selling at the drugstore for around 65 cents in its powder form. The pancake finish was slightly more coverage forward than airspun, producing what contemporary consumers would call a medium coverage matte that photographed beautifully and held reasonably well against the humidity and activity of a full day. Factor's marketing was relentlessly movie studio adjacent. The photography in his advertising and packaging consistently showed women who looked as though they were about to be photographed professionally, their skin uniformly luminous and impossibly smooth. And this association with cinematic glamour was a powerful driver of the brand's drugstore appeal, because the 1950s consumer understood that looking like a movie star and buying the products movie stars used were, at the drugstore price point, approximately the same gesture. The pressed powder compact, as distinct from the loose powder box, was the portable maintenance product in the face powder ecosystem, and it occupied a slightly different position in the marketing landscape. Where loose powder was the home application product, used at the vanity in the morning, applied with a large puff in the leisurely ritual of the dressing table, the pressed powder compact was the field tool, the thing carried in the purse and consulted in the ladies' room or at the theatre powder room to address the shine that accumulated throughout the day. The formula in a pressed compact was the same talc base as the loose powder, but compressed with a small amount of binder, typically a light wax or gum, into a firm cake that transferred to the puff without the cloud of fine powder that loose powder produced. The puffs supplied with drugstore compacts in 1953 were typically small velour or chamois discs that provided a slightly sheared down application compared to the large loose powder puff, appropriate for the touch-up function the compact was designed to perform. The technique of powder application was addressed with great specificity in the beauty literature of the period, because incorrect powder technique was considered one of the more common grooming errors visible to the socially observant eye. The most frequently cited mistakes were, in roughly descending order of severity, applying too much powder and creating a flat, chalky finish that sat on top of the foundation rather than blending with it, failing to remove excess powder with a clean brush or puff after application, leaving the surface uneven and slightly cakey at the hairline and jaw, and choosing the wrong shade, which manifested most clearly at the jaw, where the face powder met the neck and a one-shade mismatch created a visible line of demarcation that was considered one of the most easily preventable beauty errors. Beauty columns of the period sometimes called this line the tide mark, and described it with a specificity that suggested it was observed and noted by others with some frequency. The correction they prescribed, blending the powder down onto the neck or choosing a shade that matched the neck rather than the face, was technically straightforward but required a mirror with sufficient light to execute reliably. The setting function of face powder was understood in 1953 as the powder's primary purpose rather than a secondary benefit, and this understanding organized the entire application protocol. The foundation, applied first, provided the color correction and coverage. The powder set the foundation, locked it in place, absorbed the oils in the formula that would otherwise migrate and disturb the finish throughout the day, and created the dry surface that allowed rouge and eye makeup applied over it to read clearly and stay in position. A woman who skipped powder and wore only foundation was, according to the beauty consensus of her decade, doing half the job. She had laid the canvas but not sealed it, and the result would be visible deterioration before her morning was over. This relationship between foundation and powder as two linked steps in a single finishing system is the origin of the baking and setting powder techniques that contemporary beauty influencers describe as innovations, when they are in fact the most traditional tools of the cosmetic trade, temporarily obscured by several decades of the no-makeup makeup trend, and now returning with the vocabulary of discovery. The talc question that shadows all discussion of 1953 face powders is not one that the consumers of the period were aware of, because the debate about the potential carcinogenicity of cosmetic-grade talc and its possible contamination with asbestos group minerals is a late 20th and early 21st century concern that had no presence in the beauty literature or the regulatory landscape of 1953. Women applied loose talc-based powder to their faces daily, often using large puffs that generated a visible cloud of fine particles, without any awareness of the question that would eventually produce litigation, reformulation, and the widespread shift toward talc-free formulas using alternatives like cornstarch, silica, and boron nitride. The modern face powder aisle, with its prominent talc-free labelling and its emphasis on rice powder and silica bases is partly a consequence of concerns that were entirely absent from the 1953 beauty conversation. The women who used Coty Airspun daily for 50 years did so in good faith, with the information available to them, which is all that can be said of any consumer at any point in the history of an industry that regularly understands its own products better in retrospect than it did in the moment of their sale. The mineral oil question in face powder chemistry of 1953 is one of those cases where an ingredient that was standard, well tolerated, and genuinely functional in its primary application became retrospectively problematic through a combination of new formulation options and shifting consumer preference, rather than any evidence of harm. Mineral oil, the highly refined petroleum-derived oil used as an emollient in cosmetics since the late 19th century, was present in the binders used to compress loose powder into the pressed format of the compact cake, providing the film that held the particles together and allowed the puff to pick them up cleanly. At the concentrations used in pressed powder, mineral oil contributed minimally to the skin feel of the finished product, but it was there, and its presence would eventually become a marketing liability in an era when petroleum-derived ingredients in skincare products became a category of consumer concern. In 1953, mineral oil in face powder was simply a functional ingredient whose inclusion required no explanation or apology. The theatrical tradition from which modern face powder directly descends was one that the women applying their Coty Airspun at the 1953 vanity table would not have recognized as their own ancestry, but the connection is direct and documentable. Rice powder, the finely milled rice starch that the Japanese theatrical tradition had used for centuries to create the matte white face of classical performance, was one of the precursors of the modern talc-based pressed powder, and its use in Western theatrical makeup in the late 19th century established the convention that a properly finished face required a matte powder surface over whatever colour corrections or enhancements had been applied beneath it. The transition from rice powder to talc-based formulations happened gradually through the first decades of the 20th century, driven by the finer milling and more consistent particle size that talc could achieve and by the superior oil absorption properties of talc compared to rice starch, but the fundamental aesthetic principle, the matte, powdered face as the correctly finished face, travelled through this technical transition unchanged. The institutional role of face powder in the 1953 office environment was a specific application context that the beauty literature addressed with some care, because the office presented different demands than the social or domestic contexts for which most beauty advice was written. In a professional office environment, which in 1953 meant for women a relatively narrow range of occupations including secretary, receptionist, bookkeeper and schoolteacher, visible makeup was expected, but was expected to be understated, professional and consistently maintained throughout the working day. Face powder was particularly important in this context, because the shine-free face that the decade's conventions required read, under the fluorescent lighting that was becoming standard in office environments, as polished and controlled in a way that connected to the professional virtues of precision and competence. A woman whose face was shiny by 10 o'clock in the morning was not making the best impression she could on the environment her career depended on, and the compact in the desk drawer, pulled out discreetly for a quick touch-up in the ladies' room before an important meeting, was a professional tool as much as a beauty one. The talc particle size that made Coty Airspun exceptional in the 1953 market was a genuine technical achievement, and not merely a marketing claim. Standard cosmetic talc of the period was milled to a particle size in the range of 10 to 20 microns, fine enough for a smooth application but detectable as a slight powdery texture on the skin surface if applied heavily. The Airspun process, which the company had developed and patented, reduced the particle size further through an additional milling stage, and then separated the finest particles via air classification, passing the milled powder through a stream of air in which the finest particles were carried in suspension, while the larger ones fell out, collecting only the fraction with the most ultra-fine texture. The result was a powder that settled onto the skin and blended with the foundation beneath it, rather than sitting on the surface, producing the near-invisible matte finish that the brand's advertising had made famous. In 1953, the hands of the average American housewife were engaged in a set of activities that the hand cream manufacturers understood more completely than almost any other category of beauty brand, because the hands of a housewife were the site of a specific and ongoing conflict between the demands of domestic labour and the aesthetic requirements of femininity that the decade placed on women with relentless consistency. Dishwashing, cooking, cleaning, laundry, all of it was done by hand in the domestic environments of the early 50s, before the widespread adoption of automatic dishwashers and the other appliances that would eventually reduce the hand contact labour of housekeeping. The skin on those hands was assaulted daily by hot water, harsh detergent, cleaning solvents, and the simple mechanical abrasion of repetitive work, and it showed. Cracked knuckles, rough patches at the fingertips, inflamed cuticles, the tight, papery sensation of skin that had been stripped of its oils too many times too fast. These were the characteristic occupational marks of the American woman who managed a household in 1953, and the hand cream market was organised entirely around the promise of their reversal. Jergens lotion was, by sales volume and brand recognition, the dominant product in the drugstore handcare market in 1953, and its dominance was not accidental. The Andrew Jergens company had been making its almond and cherry-scented lotion since 1882, and by the post-war decade it had achieved the kind of market saturation that translated into almost reflexive purchase behaviour. Women whose mothers had kept a bottle of Jergens on the kitchen sink kept one on their own kitchen sink, and the faint almond sweetness of the fragrance was as much a part of the domestic environment as the smell of the dishcloth or the peculiar clean scent of hot water on porcelain. At 30 cents for a medium bottle and 50 cents for the large size, Jergens was priced correctly for the purchase rhythm of the product. Women bought it frequently, because the bottle on the kitchen sink was used many times per day and depleted quickly, and at 30 cents per bottle, this consumption rate was absorbed into the household budget without requiring any particular accounting. The competition at the drugstore hand cream counter was organised around several distinct product propositions. Jergens was the everyday lotion, light, quickly absorbed, meant to be applied after every hand washing rather than as a dedicated treatment. At the other end of the spectrum sat the intensive hand creams that positioned themselves as overnight or once daily treatments for severely damaged skin. Pond's Cold Cream in its hand cream application, Heinz Honey and Almond Cream, and the various medicated preparations that contained small amounts of urea or glycolic acid precursors to provide chemical exfoliation along with their moisturizing action. Between these two poles lived a middle category of richer, more emollient lotions, products like Paquin's Hand Cream, which contained glycerin and a more complex emollient base than the standard lotion, and was positioned as a step above the everyday product, without requiring the commitment of the overnight treatment. The entire price range of the category ran from 20 cents to about 65 cents per tube or bottle, making it one of the most accessible beauty categories at the drugstore counter. The active ingredient story of 1953 hand cream is a study in the contrast between the simplicity of the formulas and the effectiveness of the solutions they provided. Glycerin, which had been used in skin preparation since the mid-19th century, was the dominant humectant, a substance that attracts water from the environment and from the deeper layers of the skin to the surface, creating the sensation of moisturization by increasing water content in the outer epidermal layers. Lanolin, derived from wool fat, was the dominant emollient, a substance that coated the skin surface, reduced transepidermal water loss, and created the softening effect that made treated skin feel distinctly different from untreated skin within a few hours of application. These two ingredients, in various combinations and concentrations, form the core of virtually every hand cream and lotion on the drugstore shelf in 1953. The rest of the formula was largely carrier, fragrance, and preservative. The molecular science of moisturization had been understood well enough since the 1930s to produce genuinely effective formulas. What the following decades would add were primarily new delivery systems, new synthetic emollients with more elegant skin feel, and the marketing apparatus to turn a simple petroleum and glycerin formulation into a $70 prestige brand story. The seasonal dimension of hand care in 1953 was significant and was addressed directly in the advertising campaigns of the major brands. Winter, with its combination of cold exterior air, heated interior air, and the increased frequency of hot water exposure that cold weather seemed to generate, was the peak sales period for hand creams, and the visual vocabulary of winter hand cream advertising was consistent across brands. A pair of hands shown in close-up, the skin slightly rough or reddened in the before image, and visibly smoother and softer in the after, often photographed wearing a ring or holding a small bouquet to establish the hand's femininity and the stakes of their appearance. The message was not subtle. The condition of a woman's hands was visible to other people, including the people whose opinion of her appearance mattered, and neglecting them was a form of public grooming failure. This message was particularly charged for newly married women whose hands, specifically their ring hand, were subject to regular social scrutiny in a decade when the engagement ring was an almost universal signifier of a woman's social status. The glove relationship with hand cream is one of the more practically interesting aspects of the 1953 hand care ritual. The beauty manuals of the period regularly recommended wearing cotton gloves to bed over a generous application of heavy hand cream, creating an occlusive treatment environment in which the cream could penetrate without being rubbed off by contact with sheets and fabric. This technique, now marketed as the sleeping mask for hands by contemporary beauty brands at 10 times the price, was standard advice in the 1950s beauty literature, typically presented as the treatment for hands that had progressed beyond what daily lotion use could address. Cotton gloves for this purpose were available at the 5 and dime for 25 cents per pair, and were considered a household beauty tool with a specific seasonal application in the winter months. The same gloves served a secondary purpose as the household work gloves that beauty editors also regularly recommended as preventive hand care. The logic being that if you wore rubber gloves while washing dishes, you would be protecting the hand cream you had applied in the morning from the stripping action of the hot water and detergent, essentially maintaining the barrier you had built rather than repeatedly rebuilding it. Cuticle care was addressed within the hand cream ritual as a specific subcategory with its own dedicated products and techniques. The cuticle, that thin rim of living skin where nail and finger meet, was a point of significant aesthetic attention in 1953, because the beauty consensus of the period required not merely clean and moisturized hands, but hands on which the cuticle line was neat, pushed back, and free of the ragged hangnails and overgrowth that signalled neglect. Cuticle remover cream, a mildly caustic solution usually containing potassium hydroxide in low concentration which softened and partially dissolved the dead cuticle tissue, was available at the drugstore for around 20 cents per tube, and its application was a weekly ritual in the hand care regimens the beauty literature recommended. After the remover had acted on the cuticle for the prescribed time, the loosened tissue was pushed back with the rubber-tipped orange stick or a small metal cuticle pusher, and the resulting clean cuticle line was then coated with a rich cuticle oil. Sweet almond oil was commonly recommended, available in small bottles at the pharmacy counter for 30 cents, to maintain softness between weekly treatments. The contemporary hand care market has taken the functional imperatives of the 1953 drugstore shelf and refined them with 7 decades of ingredient science, but the aesthetic goal it is pursuing remains exactly what Jergens and Heinz Honey and Almond were selling in 1953, hands that look and feel incompatible with hard work, hands whose softness is a visible argument that their owner is cared for and cares for herself, hands that are, in the specific aesthetic vocabulary of feminine beauty culture, the right kind of hands to have. The hand cream is one of the few beauty rituals that has tracked almost without interruption from the early 19th century to the contemporary market, because the problem it addresses, hands subjected to labour and expected to look laboured over rather than worked hard, has not changed in any fundamental way. The ingredients are more sophisticated, the packaging is more aspirational, the ritual is unchanged. The domestic labour context of hand cream use in 1953 was shifting in ways that the hand care advertising was beginning to track, because the introduction of household appliances into the post-war suburban home was gradually changing the specific demands placed on a housewife's hands. The automatic washing machine, which had been available since the 1930s, but achieved widespread suburban adoption in the late 1940s and early 50s, reduced the hand contact time involved in laundry, historically one of the most hand-damaging domestic tasks, involving prolonged exposure to hot water, lye-based soap, and the physical strain of wringing and scrubbing. The automatic dishwasher, a more recent arrival in the middle-class home, was beginning its diffusion into suburban kitchens by 1953, though it would not reach majority adoption until the following decade. In the meantime, the woman whose kitchen did not yet have a dishwasher was washing every dish by hand after every meal, exposing her hands to hot water and dish detergent multiple times daily, in a routine that was the single most aggressive assault on the hand cream she had applied in the morning. The competitive dynamic between the hand cream brands in 1953 operated partly on the axis of ingredient transparency and partly on the more amorphous axis of brand personality and social aspiration. Jergens had personality. The almond and cherry scent was so familiar and so consistently pleasant that it had become a kind of olfactory landmark, a smell that triggered memories of kitchen sinks and mothers' hands and the domestic interiors of childhood across a generation of American women. Heinz Honey and Almond had its own version of this personality, slightly more delicate in its fragrance approach, somewhat more aspirationally feminine in its positioning. The medicated hands of Perfumes, the clinical authority of the urea-containing preparations, the evangelical earnestness of the vitamin E-enriched formulas that were beginning to appear, each product spoke to the woman it was designed for in a specific emotional register, and the woman who chose between them was making, without necessarily being conscious of it, a small statement about who she understood herself to be and how she related to the daily labour of her hands. The geography of hand cream use in 1953 was not limited to the kitchen sink. Beauty manuals of the period recommended applying hand cream at the vanity table at the end of the morning grooming routine, after the nail enamel had been applied and before putting on the day's first pair of gloves, the gloves that the etiquette of the period required as outdoor accessories and that provided their own form of incidental hand protection against the elements. The bedroom vanity application was a different ritual from the kitchen sink application, slower, more deliberate, more connected to the broader project of grooming as self-care. A woman who applied hand cream at the vanity was completing her beauty routine, adding the finishing treatment to the hands that the completed nail enamel had made worth presenting. The same product applied at the kitchen sink after washing the breakfast dishes was maintenance, functional, almost involuntary. The vanity table application was intention. Both mattered. Both were the same tube of Jergens, the gelatin capsule hand treatment that appeared in certain beauty manuals of the 1953 period is one of those beauty rituals that sits at the intersection of genuine skincare innovation and the era's enthusiasm for the quasi-medical authority of pharmaceutical-adjacent products. Vitamin E capsules, available at the pharmacy counter rather than the beauty section, sold as a nutritional supplement rather than a cosmetic, were being pierced and applied directly to the hands and cuticles by women who had read, in one of the many health and beauty crossover articles that women's magazines published regularly, that vitamin E's antioxidant properties made it beneficial for skin repair. The woman cracking open a vitamin E capsule over her knuckles in 1953 was operating at the earliest edge of an idea that has since become one of the most commercially powerful concepts in the beauty industry. If you were to walk into a Rexall drugstore on a bright September morning in 1953 with exactly $1 in your pocket and the intention of purchasing everything you needed to present a properly finished face to the world, you could do it. You could buy a Maybelline Cake Mascara for 25 cents, a Tangy Natural Lipstick for 35 cents, a small box of Coty Airspun face powder for 30 cents, and walk out with a dime in change and the complete toolkit for the daily beauty ritual that the decade considered the minimum acceptable investment in your own appearance. This was not an accident. The pricing architecture of the American drugstore beauty market in 1953 was calibrated with extraordinary precision to the real disposable income of the women it served, and the result was a consumer economy that democratized the practice of cosmetic self-presentation in a way that had no precedent in the previous history of beauty culture. The broader context of this dollar is worth establishing, because 1953 was a specific economic moment in American life with a specific texture that the beauty market both reflected and helped to create. The post-war prosperity that had been building since 1945 had reached a stable plateau by the early 50s, distributed unevenly but present in enough American households to create a genuine mass consumer market for products that had previously been either luxury goods for the wealthy or improvised substitutes for the working poor. The housewife in the new suburban development outside Cleveland or Atlanta or Portland was not rich. Her husband's salary as a mid-level office worker or skilled tradesman gave them enough for a modest house payment, a car, weekly groceries, and a small amount for personal spending. But she was not, by historical standards, poor either. She was the target consumer of the 1950s mass market, and every major consumer goods company in America was competing intensely for the portion of her weekly spending that she directed toward personal grooming. The beauty products on the drugstore shelf were priced against each other, against the woman's sense of what each category was worth, and against the implicit promise that each product's advertising made about the magnitude of the transformation it would deliver. The mascara at 25 cents competed with the mascara at 45 cents, not primarily on chemistry, though the chemistry differed somewhat, but on the strength of the dream each brand could credibly sell. Maybelline's dream was quiet and reliable. It was the democratic dream, the one that said every woman deserved beautiful eyes regardless of her income. Max Factor's dream was louder and more specifically aspirational. It was the Hollywood dream, the one that said the distance between you and the woman on the silver screen could be closed by a product at your local pharmacy. Both dreams were affordable. Both were purchased in enormous quantities by women who understood, on some level, that they were buying dreams alongside the chemistry, and who considered this a reasonable transaction. The relationship between the drugstore beauty market and the magazine beauty coverage that supported it was one of mutual creation and commercial dependency that shaped the entire cultural conversation about female appearance in the 1950s. The beauty pages of Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, 17, and American Home were read by tens of millions of women each month, and the editorial voice of those pages, authoritative, friendly, simultaneously aspirational and practical, was the primary channel through which the norms of feminine grooming were transmitted from the advertising industry to the consumer. Beauty editors in this era were not independent critics of the products they covered. They were participants in a system in which advertiser relationships strongly influenced editorial content, in which the brands that bought the most advertising pages received the most favourable coverage, and in which the beauty ideal promoted on the editorial pages and the beauty ideal promoted in the adjacent advertisements were, by design, the same ideal. The woman reading McCall's in 1953 was receiving a unified message from every page she turned. This is what a properly presented woman looks like. This is what she buys. This is what she does. And all of it is available to you at the price points your budget can support. The beauty ideal embedded in that message deserves honest examination, because it was not an ideal that included everyone and did not pretend to. The face that Coty and Revlon and Max Factor were selling in their advertising imagery was a specific face, pale, symmetrical, European in its feature proportions, with a particular combination of dark brows, defined eyes, rosy cheeks, and red or rose lips that constituted the mid-century American feminine ideal as distilled from Hollywood film, women's magazine photography, and the post-war consensus about what femininity looked and smelled and felt like. Women who did not start from this face, who were black, brown, Asian, or otherwise outside the narrow visual frame the mainstream beauty market had constructed as its default, were either served by separate, often inferior market segments, or were implicitly invited to approximate the standard as closely as their starting point allowed. This was the beauty industry's greatest failure and its most persistent one, and it is not overstating the case to describe it as a form of aesthetic violence that had real consequences for the women it excluded from the frame of the desirable. The products on the drugstore shelf in 1953 were, simultaneously and without contradiction, genuinely useful tools for personal expression and beauty ritual, and instruments of a social system that used those tools to enforce a narrow and exclusionary set of requirements for feminine acceptability. A woman who applied her Jergens lotion and her Coty powder and her Maybelline mascara in the morning was performing an act of self-care and self-expression that she had genuinely chosen within the options her culture made available to her, and she was also conforming to a set of expectations so thoroughly naturalized that the concept of not conforming would have required a level of social courage that the decade actively and systematically discouraged. Both of these things were true at the same time, and any account of the 1953 drugstore beauty counter that leaves out either truth is telling only a partial story. What the dollar bought, beyond the mascara, the powder, the lipstick, was a sense of participation in the feminine culture of the period, a sense of belonging to the community of women who took their appearance seriously and had the habits, the products, and the daily rituals to prove it. This is not a trivial thing. The contemporary vocabulary of self-care, with its emphasis on ritual, on the sensory pleasure of beauty products, on the value of taking dedicated time for one's own grooming and appearance as an act of self-respect, is a more articulate version of what the drugstore beauty market was selling in 1953, translated into the language of the 21st century. The Coty Airspun powder and the Drunk Elephant moisturizer are not the same product, but the woman buying them is seeking the same thing, a version of herself in the mirror that corresponds to her best understanding of what she can look like when she has paid attention. The drugstore beauty counter of 1953 built the mass-market beauty industry that exists today. The price points that Revlon and Maybelline established in the early 50s, the idea that cosmetics should be available across a wide range from the truly mass to the accessible premium, are the architecture on which every drugstore beauty shelf from Walgreens to Target to CVS has been constructed. The concept of the beauty brand story, the founder narrative, the Hollywood connection, the scientific authority that Max Factor and Helena Rubinstein and Charles Revson built in the 40s and 50s is the same concept that Kylie Jenner and Pat McGrath and Charlotte Tilbury are selling today with different photographs and the same fundamental pitch. The woman at the Rexall counter in 1953, weighing the Maybelline against the Max Factor with a quarter and a dime in her hand, was making the same calculation that the contemporary beauty consumer makes with a phone and a credit card. How much transformation, how much self-expression, how much participation in the culture's idea of beauty is this amount of money worth to me today? The answer, across 7 decades, has been enough. Enough to keep the counter stocked, the shelf full, the dream affordable, and just within reach. The power of the 1953 drugstore beauty market was not that it gave women everything they wanted. It did not. It gave them a narrow selection of what the industry had decided they should want, at prices calibrated to convert desire into purchase as efficiently as possible, within a cultural framework that served some women well and excluded others systematically. Its power was that it recognized, earlier than almost any other sector of the consumer economy, that the desire to look and feel beautiful is not a luxury desire confined to the wealthy, and that a market organized around this recognition, around the belief that the woman with $1 in her pocket deserves the same access to the tools of self-presentation as the woman with $10, is a market with essentially unlimited depth. This recognition, expressed in compressed rouge cakes and small glass bottles of cologne and flat tins of mascara, built an industry. It also, imperfectly and with many failures, built a culture in which taking care of one's appearance was understood not as vanity but as practice, a daily ritual of self-attention that, at its best, was one of the small, genuine pleasures available to women navigating a world that offered them fewer choices than they deserved. The labour economics of the 1953 beauty industry as a whole, the vast system of manufacturing, distribution, retail display and advertising that put that dollar's worth of mascara and powder and lipstick on the drugstore shelf, were structured by the same gender inequalities that the products on the shelf were simultaneously reflecting and, in small ways, attempting to address. The women who manufactured the lipstick bullets at the Revlon factory in New Jersey, who staffed the Rexall pharmacy counter, who wrote the beauty columns in McCall's and Ladies' Home Journal, were all working within an economy that paid them significantly less than their male counterparts, offered them fewer advancement opportunities, and evaluated their professional performance against standards that included, routinely and without apology, their physical appearance and their conformity to the same beauty norms that the products on their shelves or in their columns were selling. The beauty industry was in this sense a perfect closed system. It employed women to produce and sell and write about beauty products. It paid them wages that made those products a meaningful portion of their discretionary income, and it simultaneously constructed the beauty standards that gave the products their value. The consumer protection landscape of 1953 was significantly thinner than the contemporary regulatory environment and had direct implications for the safety and accuracy of the products on the drugstore beauty shelf. The Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938 had established FDA jurisdiction over cosmetics for the first time, requiring that cosmetics not be adulterated or misbranded, but it did not require pre-market safety testing, did not mandate ingredient disclosure on packaging, and did not require manufacturers to report adverse reactions. The woman buying her Coty rouge or her Jergens lotion in 1953 had no systematic way of knowing what was in the product she was purchasing, no mechanism for reporting an adverse reaction to a regulatory authority, and no access to any safety data that the manufacturer might have collected internally. The industry operated largely on the basis of self-regulation and the practical incentive to avoid products that injured their customers enough to generate negative press, which is a form of accountability but a weak and inconsistent one. The beauty industry's impact on the self-perception of the women it served is the final and most consequential dimension of the 1953 drugstore beauty counter, and it is the one that the industry itself was least equipped to analyse objectively. The products worked, in the sense that they did what they promised to do. The mascara darkened and lengthened the lashes, the powder matted the face, the lipstick coloured the mouth, the hand cream softened the hands. But what they promised to do was embedded within a larger promise that no product could fulfill, the promise that a correctly assembled set of cosmetic purchases would produce a correctly assembled woman, that the right rouge and the right powder and the right perfume would make a woman recognizable as the version of herself that the culture of her decade had decided she should be. This promise was always and structurally impossible. Identity is not assembled from cosmetic purchases, however carefully chosen, and yet it drove the consumer beauty market then, and drives it now, because the desire to look in the mirror and see oneself clearly, without the distortion of circumstance and fatigue, and the accumulated weight of being a person in a complicated world, is not a commercial invention. It is something much older and more fundamental, and the drugstore shelf in 1953, with all its limitations and compromises and brilliant calibrations of aspiration to price, was simply the era's particular answer to it.